Thank you, Aldo, and thank you, Allison. And welcome to Valeria and Fanny and Florencia, who are going to be leading our conversation. My name is Amy Starczewski, and I direct the Oral History Master of Arts program here at Columbia, and I'm curating our book club this year. This is a new thing for us. We've always done Thursday evening events, and we decided to experiment with a new format. And I chose a book club in part because a book club is a space where learning happens socially and where relationships are actually part of the goal of the learning and of the activity. And we really do want our programming to be spaces where people connect and build knowledge together, just like they do in oral history. So I thought that the sort of sociality of the book club would nicely mirror what we do in the rest of our work. Also, book clubs are for pleasure. I think we all need pleasure in our lives these days. And we really do want our events to feel like treats, not chores. And so we thought maybe by experimenting with a book club format, we could take it a little bit in that direction. So welcome to our first book club, and please do let us know how it's going. We'll send a survey after this event so we can use your feedback to inform how we run the next two. We're going to have 2 more book clubs in the next 2 months. In this book club, as you all know, we're reading oral history novels. I think that's a genre that I made up. And I want us to think about, if we put these things in a bucket together, what can we learn about oral history through imagining that there's such a genre as the oral history novel? And in my personal definition, that includes novels that write about the experience of doing oral history and documentary work, like Lost Children Archive does, novels that take the form of a fictional oral history and really play with the genre of oral history as a writing and literary genre, and Everything for Everyone, our second book, is an example of that. And books that use oral history as source material, like Liberty, the third book that we're going to read. So each of our book club events will feature 1 or more oral historians in conversation with the author. And this week I am very honored to introduce Fanny Garcia and Florencia Ruiz Mendoza. And so I'm going to introduce them, tell you a little bit about who they are, and then I'll hand it off to them to welcome us and introduce Valeria. So Fanny Garcia is a Honduran American oral historian contributing work to Central American studies. Her work focuses on immigration justice, detention and incarceration, family separation, and the transnational impact of failed border policies. She is the recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Oral History Association to work on Separated, an oral history project, which documents the lived experiences of families impacted by family separation. So you can see why I thought of her immediately to be part of this conversation. And her work is informed by her own life's history as a formerly undocumented immigrant and as a survivor of trauma and generational poverty. She is a graduate of Los Angeles Valley College, UCLA, and OHMA. And then Florencia Ruiz Mendoza is, like Valeria Luiselli, from Mexico City. She has been an advocate against forced disappearance for almost 20 years. She initiated her career documenting state crimes for the historical report Que no vuelva a suceder, acknowledged as Patrimony of Memory. She collaborated with the Historical Memory Project at John Jay College, CUNY, the International Center for Transitional Justice, and Latin American Network at the International Sites of Conscience. And her literary work has been featured in Los Acentos Review and Restless Immigrants Workshop blog. She is a reader of color for the Master's Review. She holds a BA in history from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and was a Columbia University Human Rights Advocate in 2009, an Oral History Summer Institute Fellow in 2010, which is how we came to know each other. And she's currently a student in OHMA, so we've had a long journey together, and I'm so pleased to welcome both Fanny and Florencia to guide our conversation tonight. So with that, I'll turn it over to them.
Hello, everyone. I'll start first because I'm honored to do the land acknowledgement today. And I'm really honored to do so because it's my first one ever, and it feels even more appropriate because the book we will discuss tonight has as one of its central themes the erasure and misinterpretation of Native history and culture. And so I join you today from what is now called Harlem, New York, but it is and will always be the unceded land of Lenapehoking, the Lenape name for the Lenape land, which spans from Western Connecticut to Eastern Pennsylvania and the Hudson Valley to Delaware, with Manhattan at its center. And due to centuries of colonialism perpetuated by genocide, forced displacement, and systemic oppression, today the Lenape diaspora is dispersed throughout the US and Canada. And Rebecca is going to drop a link to the chat called Native Land, and it's a digital mapping tool that you can use to navigate and learn whose land you're currently a guest on. And please use the chat to share with us where you are located based on this map. And I would also like to take this moment to uplift some of the work and stories of contemporary Native people, in particularly women, who have tirelessly fought for social justice and to ensure Native history, life experiences, culture, and knowledge is not forgotten. And I want to start by connecting the struggles of Native people across the Americas with the recognition of I, Rigoberta Menchú, an Indian woman in Guatemala, a book written from interviews with the human rights activist that chronicles her life and the atrocities she witnessed against Indigenous people in Guatemala. And Rebecca is also going to drop the link for that book, and also want to uplift the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, whose book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, reminds us all to get curious about our natural world and encourages us to center Indigenous wisdom in the work that it will take to build a relationship with the natural world. And lastly, but not least, I want to encourage everyone to watch the documentary Warrior Women about Madonna Thunderhawk, an American Indian movement leader who founded the We Will Remember Survival School as a Native alternative to government-run education. And I encourage you all to engage with the links that Rebecca has dropped into the chat and engage with the works of these women and honor and others that you know of. And in the process, honor the Native women whose courage and solidarity in the face of many attempts to erase Native culture, history, and life, as it reminds us to speak truth to power. So thank you all for being here today, and to Amy and OHMA for organizing this event and the rest of the book club series that will explore the connections between oral history and literature. And I'm really excited. And with this, I'll pass it over to Florencia, who will introduce our guest of honor, Valeria.
Thank you so much, Fanny. And thank you again to Amy and to the OHMA program for making this event possible. Thank you, Valeria, so much for being here with us tonight. I'm gonna go with this formality quick so we can jump right into our conversation with Valeria. Thank you so much. Well, Valeria Luiselli, she was born in Mexico City and grew up in South Korea, South Africa, and India. An acclaimed writer of both fiction and nonfiction, she is the author of Sidewalks, Faces in the Crowd, The Story of My Teeth, Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 Questions, and Lost Children Archives. She is the recipient of the 2019 MacArthur Fellowship, and for Lost Children Archive, she won the Dublin Literature Award, and she's the recipient 2 times of Los Angeles Times Book Prize, the Carnegie Medal, and an American Book Award. She's been nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Kirkus Prize, and also she has been a National Book Foundation 5 under 35 honoree and the recipient of a Bearing Witness Fellowship from the Art of Justice Fund. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Granta, among many other publications. Well, thank you so much, Valeria, for being here with us tonight. We invited you to talk with us to the program because we believe that oral history offers such a variety of possibilities in terms of what we could do with this beautiful practice. And we would love to know about your experience with interviewing immigrant children in an immigration court in New York City. We, as oral historian, for us, the act of interviewing is its core in our activity. We reflect and discuss constantly in this space that we call interviewing space, which oral historian Alessandro Portelli, he talks about that the interviewing space actually creates another a space for narrative. And yes, your previous book, Tell Me How It Ends, is organized and emerge as your experience as a interpreter in the immigration court, Valeria. Although we know that your exercise on interviewing, it wasn't like an oral history exercise per se, but it was an act on interviewing. So having this in mind, we would love to know, would you tell us, please, how this experience influenced you when you crafted Lost Children Archive? Because the way I see you every day, especially finishing your interviews, I could see you going home every day and carrying in your mind, in your heart, and in your body all those stories that in your own words you talk about the children fragmented narratives. So would you please tell us about the process of interviewing and how those stories, the children's stories, were incorporated in your work, Valeria? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florencia. Muchas gracias también, Fanny. Thanks both for your warm and beautiful welcomes. This map that you shared is fantastic. I'd never seen it before, and I just got very excited finding things. I found the land of my maternal line of ancestry, who are Otomi, Ñañús. And I was kind of surprised to see the size of the Ñañú territory. I had a misconception, I think. Anyway, thank you for your very good question, Florencia. It's a difficult question to answer because I think a lot of process happens very much kind of in the darker parts of our souls, right? So it's hard for me to know in which way exactly hearing, listening got processed to become writing. But I should start by saying that I had no desire when I started working in court as a translator, interpreter, to write about the situation, because it felt like many other things that I've done in my life or faced too incomprehensible, too large, too shape-shifting for me to be able to grasp it in writing. So I had no initial desire to write about exactly what I was listening to and witnessing in court. It was really actually later on through the insistence and editorial companionship of a long time editor and friend, John Freeman, that I ventured to write more directly about the testimonies in my book, Tell Me How It Ends, and not Lost Children Archive. And Tell Me How It Ends was a response to my feeling that when I was writing Lost Children Archive, I couldn't quite do justice in capturing the brutality of the situation that I was witnessing. I felt that I was doing no justice to what I was seeing so closely, and also doing no justice to the novel, Lost Children Archive itself, by starting to feel that I had to turn that novel into some kind of historical receptacle of oral histories of what was what I was witnessing and hearing, right? And placing that kind of commitment on a novel to do that kind of job almost always, I think, results in failed narratives, because you can't instrumentalize fiction without seeing it become a kind of flatter version of itself. A novel has to kind of remain porous and ambiguous enough and large enough to not be a single kind of narrative, right, with one single intention. So I stopped writing Lost Children Archive completely at some point when I was working and listening to testimonies in court. I should say this for those who don't necessarily know this story, but I began working in court in 2015, shortly after the crisis was declared in the news in the summer of 2014, where more than 100,000 children had arrived in a span of 6 months alone, and undocumented, and seeking asylum or other forms of immigration relief. And so the government declared a crisis, not on behalf so much of the children, but of the governmental institutions that had to resolve their situation. So the empathy was not so much on the children, but on kind of themselves and their institutions. And I became involved in the crisis because I could not be in some way present. It was something that was keeping me awake and incredibly enraged. And so I asked for possibilities of becoming involved in some way or the other. And a lawyer put me in contact with an organization in court that basically needed people to listen to testimonies, translate them to English, and relay them to a lawyer that might, or an organization of lawyers that might then decide to defend that child, given that testimony, against a deportation order. So that was the exact task that I had. Now, at some point in working, doing exactly that, there was a kind of feeling of a lot of desperation, in the sense that I started realizing that a lot of the stories that I was hearing were devastating, but were also most likely not going to be successful in a courtroom, because they simply didn't fit the very narrow definitions of who is eligible for certain kinds of immigration relief. And that narrowness, of course, is incredibly frustrating. And the outcome of the very real destinies of people were being defined by this completely sort of absurd and rigid labyrinthine system. So I think that is kind of where maybe fiction kicks in for me, more generally, as a kind of almost emergency mode operation, in which, like, I was capable of being present only because I was, at the same time as being present, somewhat writing as I don't know if some of you experience this, but I think a lot of us in situations of enormous pain or worry, and family members in hospitals or what, are able to somewhat get through with a kind of narrative layer that allows us to see with not a greater distance necessarily, but with a kind of distance. And that's not too close, and that's definitely not too far, but that keeps us a kind of buffer. And so I think I started relating to the situation very much with writing or fiction mode. And then I also didn't know the outcomes of some of the stories of children that I heard in court. In some cases, I became a kind of appointed translator for a very long-term relation. So I was able to oversee the cases of a few kids that ended in very good outcomes, by the way. And I stayed on as their translator for years in different moments of the process. But in some other cases, most other cases, that was not what happened. And so I never knew what happened to some of those children. And I think that the space of not knowing was the space that is kind of pulsating at the heart of Lost Children Archive, particularly two girls that I interviewed in court and whose case had moved me very deeply and had also enraged me, because I was told quite quickly after transcribing their story that it wasn't going to sum up to a successful case. And that haunted me a lot. And those two figures, those two girls, haunted me profoundly. And they are very much at the heart of the novel, right? They a very fictionalized version of them appear in the novel.
Thank you, Valeria. One of my favorite quotes in the book is on page 155, and you talk about how any understanding of historical events requires some form of reenactment of the past. It was just such a beautiful line. And it talks about how you need to expand, or like an accordion, right? Expand and retract because of what you have to see, of the reality of the situation. And it got me thinking about American reenactments and how they're a form of myth telling rather than truth telling. And how the reasons why they serve that purpose might be to kind of obscure tragedy, pain, death, massacre, and I think in particular in regards to the Southwest and Native territory, it might serve that purpose. So I would love for you to talk to us about that, because it very much, you've talked about it in a New Yorker article, but I think it comes into play in this book as well.
Yeah, but be careful, Fanny, because you're hitting my obsession. And so I can just go on about this issue. So you might have to stop me with the issue of reenactment, which I find such a bizarre tradition, such a kind of almost scary thing, because it's mostly taken over by middle-aged guys who are playing at being soldiers and cowboys, and they are intensely worried about the exact button that they have to use for the blue coat uniform, or the exact position of the gun in the trench at the hour in which it should be shot, and yet are kind of very voluntarily blind to the greater currents or undercurrents of history that are playing out in a reenactment, or let's say being effaced in a reenactment, but existed in the real event. So, for example, in the tradition of reenactments of the of the Civil War, slavery is often just not really discussed, thought about, part of the scene, but yet the scene, the battles will take place with exactitude, right? At exactly the time that they occurred in the real world, in the real chronology. And so it happens also with Wild West reenactments, which are the reenactments that have occupied my imagination for many years. One of the incomprehensible things is that from most reenactment skits in the Southwest, particularly Tombstone, Mexicans and Native Americans and Black people are completely absent. They don't appear even as enemies. It's just as if they hadn't existed. So usually what's being played in a reenactment in the Southwest kids, is lawfulness against lawlessness, and they're all white cowboys, and women are not present, except really almost always as prostitutes, and always in a kind of comic, satirical, like they're not fully human. What they the roles they're asked to play are kind of always demeaning. And anyway, all that said, my lack of love for reenactment, I have been very obsessed with this tradition and have been conducting interviews in reenactment spaces for a long time. And very recently, I went just a couple of weeks ago to ASU, Arizona State University, to give a workshop for a really interesting group of people who basically are the borderlands Shakespeareans, so people who teach Shakespeare in the borderlands, and in El Paso and in different places in California. And my idea of, since I'm not a Shakespearean myself, and did not really feel like I could teach Shakespeare, what I talked to them about was this town called Shakespeare in New Mexico, which I've been obsessed with for many years, and which I would very much like to invade in a kind of reconquista mode and take over, not myself really, but and with no guns, obviously, but with people through theater, offering kind of counter reenactments of the histories that have been effaced in the region. But anyway, so that project is in the make, actually, as now, because after you've read about this very old obsession of mine, that's sort of where I'm where I'm at the moment. I'm still plan to one day meet a donor who might really want to give enough money so that we can buy Shakespeare New Mexico back and turn it into a town for Borderlands archive and for counter reenactment cultures. But most people, when I tell them that I want to buy Shakespeare New Mexico, laugh. They don't think I'm serious, but you'll see.
One really quick follow-up question to that, Valeria, is from your experience with interviewing, how do you see interviewing or oral history as a reenactment of memories? And that's where my connection was to that one line in the book.
It's a really good question. I haven't really thought about it very much. I don't know if I can offer you a decent answer. I think there's a difference in the sense that reenactment, in the way that I'm thinking and sort of also countering reenactment, is more of like a very curated, conveniently curated version of history that just gets played in a loop and reinforces an idea of a kind of collective myth, which I think is the case with for example, Wild West reenactments, where the myth of a region that was unpeopled but then settled by its very decent inhabitants is just something that gets reinforced over and over again in kind of pop culture and the material, and kind of from Hollywood to Tombstone kind of tourist trap entertainment, right? It's just a myth that gets told and retold. And I think in that sense that's very different from the oral experience of telling, especially if telling is a personal testimony, right? I don't know that is quite a form of reenactment, but I'm sure psychologically speaking, or psychologists might have an interesting view on how retelling is maybe a form of rewriting, reenacting, and what happens in the strata of memory when something gets told many times, right?
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria, for your comments, and I don't think this would be, I don't believe that this is my role to read a beautiful excerpt of your book, but I definitely want to give our dear audience a proof of how this delicious narrative, and then I'll go on with my question. In mass map, for example, even if the names were written on it, I think I spotted the town called Bowie, north of the big dry valley, right on the railroad tracks, which Geronimo and his people had boarded a train after their final surrender. I also spotted Skeleton Canyon, the southwest of the Chiricahua Mountains, which was where Geronimo and his people were captured before boarding that training ball, and of course, and the Dos Cabezas Peaks, which is the world with that ghost, with the ghost of Chief Cheese still walks around. So then I noticed that on this map, right in the center of the valley between the Dragoons and the Chiricahuas, Ma had marked 2 X's with a pen. Mama had made those marks because she was sure that some lost children were there. 2 X's. Then I realized maybe the 2 X's were the 2 girls Mama often spoke about, Manuela's daughters who had gone missing. Valeria, in your book, your book is a story of a family is a disintegrating family traveling from New York to Arizona, but also major themes come across in the journey of that family: unaccompanied migrant children, the Native American stories of exodus, forced relocation, genocides. Also, I saw very present the need of naming new names as Geronimo, Cochise, Mangas Coloradas, Nietzsche, rather than Washington, Jefferson, or Robert E. Lee. I really love that proposal, that equation, because it roars the necessity of naming with the right names, and how this narrative contradicts the foundational narratives of this country. Your novel also remarks the harmful nature of euphemisms as agents that distort memory and narratives. I mean, the need to document and create archives is quite visible in your book. There's this universal and omnipresent tension throughout the book, the tension between remembering and forgetting, memory and oblivion, silences and echoes, documenting and erasing. Even, I would love to read, most lives get erased, Papa said, lost in the whirlpool of the trash we call history. So this is so, I mean, the subjects that you put together in almost one paragraph, Valeria, it's to me, it's phenomenal how you were able to put together in short spaces of narrative so profound topics. And once again, I would love you to tell us about the creative process, how you little by little started to incorporate those universal topics that there are with such transcendence for the story of this country. And I would love to know, yes, when you started to have those conversations about foundational myths, reenactments, naming the people and naming the places, putting them in the map, and how you start to incorporate all of those themes in your narrative. Thank you.
Yeah, naming, you know, there's an old anecdote with Juan Sabaeta, I believe he was called, who was from the Jumano people, and he had a lot of dealings with the Spaniards in their early explorations of what is now the southwest of the US. And the Spaniards who were trying to decide whether to go deeper into what is now New Mexico and Arizona from El Paso or not. And as they were constantly in a endeavor to create cartographies that would represent the region and allow them to sort of understand the limits and the possibilities of conquest and colonization. And so Juan Sabaeta was asked about the people who lived in those regions, and he listed at least 32 peoples. The people of the big river, the people that eat small fish, the people that this, that, and he provides a very beautiful kind of sonic map of names that populate a region. And then when the Spaniards translated that to their cartography of the region, they called the entire region the unpeopled, el despoblado in español, no? So I think that's, it's very much the kind of archive, because that is what remains an archive, the cartography that names the spaces unpeopled. For me, the very interesting and compelling and necessary task is to find cracks in the archive, so to speak, so as to kind of be able to dig out the grains of history that remain invisible, that remain invisibilized, right? And that sometimes requires the sort of mundane and for some people maybe boring tasks of, just for example, to give you a recent example of something I'm trying to work on related to Shakespeare precisely, of looking at the population census in a given year. So I've been looking at the census because of Shakespeare, New Mexico, because there's very few documents that speak about the space, and the one that exists, for example, is a kind of amateur history written by the settler who bought Shakespeare in the 1920s, and who sort of slowly made sure that the people of the town kind of left. So she speaks about a kind of group of brown children playing in a porch that eventually, luckily, disappear. And she speaks of like a bad neighbor who was un brujo Jackie, who they have a lot of trouble with, and eventually also finally get him to leave. So they kind of disappear, all the people. And but kind of narrate their coming to this town and to settle this town as a kind of not only a heroic endeavor of proclamation of freedom and new land, but also also do so in a way that becomes the only narrative, the only existing kind of trace. And so the question is, how do you go back and see who actually lived there, and imagine. So with the Shakespearean borderlanders, I was doing exactly an exercise in which we were looking at the senses and trying to imagine character sketches for the people who lived there in the 18th. A miner born in Mexico, Juan Elias, a domestic worker, Albina Tostado, born in Mexico, all the people that are not really named by history or given any kind of space in an archive. And I'm not a historian. My instrument is fiction, and that's a lot of responsibility too, right? Trying to imagine the lives of those who cannot respond for themselves anymore because they no longer live here. But I think that, sort of remaining very, very conscious of the way that fiction may or may not intervene in an archive that way is something I'm at least very interested in. But it's sort of I don't have a formula. I go kind of project by project, and I just see where things are, what things are missing, and what possibly could get me thinking about them, right? And sometimes it's a census, and sometimes it's oral histories. A lot of it is oral histories. A lot of it is maps, and the things that are missing, the things that are mapped out of a map rather than what is being mapped, and so on and so forth.
Valeria, I have to admit that when I started reading your book, like a total book nerd, I went and searched for the definition of archive. And I learned, it comes from the Greek and the Latin and all these other places that are so far removed from the people that I interview, which are people from Centro America, Mexico, living in small aldeas very far away. And the definition of archive is to document like important historical documents and governmental papers, And one thing that I loved in the book was this idea of the inventory of echoes. And in the book, you really gave us so many examples that you just kind of described of what an archive could be, including books, photographs, songs, symphonies, So I would love to take it to ask you a question about that. Like, what were the definitions of an archive that you were grappling with? And did you have difficulty choosing? And that's why you gave us so many different escape routes for the book that we could like jump off at any point and come back when we needed to,
Yeah. So the question is exactly like, what are the echoes or
the different definitions for archives? How did you answer that for yourself?
Yeah, that's a hard one, right? As you've known from your own researches, like our archive from the Greek has to do with sort of origin, right? And the archive, I think, the way we think about it is definitely a space that claims an authority because it is a receptacle of the material vestiges of history, and is then therefore the only kind of direct connection to history, right? It's a kind of portal of sorts. And however, as Arlette Fargue, one of the most interesting, I think, theorists of the archive, whom I quote quite extensively in the book, says, well, of course, but an archive presupposes an archivist hand that collects and classifies, right? And so, of course, an archive is not something that offers any kind of objective entrance point to history. It is already curated it is necessarily missing much more than it contains. What it doesn't contain didn't make it there for very specific reasons that have to do with kind of systemic forms of silencing and shutting and erasing. So how does one think of an archive as a possibility of bringing to life things that are missing, right? That are already missing. So, and how does one not then just reproduce a kind of institutional violence in storytelling, because the material that one is telling a story with is what did make it to the archive and not what didn't make it. So I find a lot of difficult contradictions there with working in archives, and then what gets considered an archive and what doesn't, what gets to be considered knowledge and what doesn't, right?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I could have a much longer conversation with you about that. But we're going to open it up to the audience. And we've already gotten several in the chat. One person asked if you could tell us what happened to the two girls that you worked with and informed and were mentioned in Lost Children Archive.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
Yes, that somebody in the chat asked if you know what happened to the two girls that you mentioned in Lost Children Archive that were based on real people.
No, unfortunately, I don't.
Okay, and then someone else said, let's see, a literary question about the tension between the foreground story of the two parents who have the luxury and take the luxury of destroying their own family, and the encompassing story of children bereft of family, and vice versa of necessity. I'd love to know more about this and about the boxes and objects that are carried and cared for by the family, even more than they take care of each other as they travel. This is from Lynette in the chat.
I mean, I don't think of destruction of family as a luxury, but I think I do understand where you're coming from in your question. I think very clearly two very, very different life experiences in terms of economic possibility and privilege are being kind of played simultaneously, right? One is a story of children who are forced to flee circumstances of unspeakable violence or poverty or both, and to leave families behind, or in some cases to move toward family. And we are also seeing the life of a middle-class family that's breaking apart, right? But that is, I mean, how our world is. We live in a world with a spectrum of economic, cultural, enormous gaps and differences in possibilities and backgrounds, right? And this novel is a slice of life in the way that many novels are, that portrays and juxtaposes these two realities. There are many more that could be taken and also sort of put in the same space of the pages, but those are the two that I was interested in working with, right? Now I don't know if I as the writer don't feel like I can be sort of the moral judge of any of my characters. I think if I were to judge them morally, I would do a terrible job as a writer, right? I think one has to work with characters, not with a kind of neutrality, because that's impossible, right? But with really an attempt to see them wholly, right? As wholly, not HOL, but WH, and really try to not understand them as simply carriers of one or two identity labels, right? So yeah, I don't know if my answer is kind of what you're looking for, but that's very much my position on this matter. And in terms of the boxes, I'm not sure what it is exactly that you want to know about the boxes, but I'm happy to read a follow-up question about the boxes, like what it is that you want to know about the boxes.
We also have, since we have the conversation tonight is happening in English and Spanish because we have interpreters working in the background. I think the next question from Fernanda Espinosa in the chat about the differences in title. In Spanish, it's called Desierto Sonoro, or Sound Deserts, and in English, Lost Children Archive. Can you speak to us about the differences in language in the novel?
Yes, I always have this problem in my books in English and Spanish have wildly different titles. For example, my first novel is titled in Spanish Los Ingrávidos, a very beautiful word that means those without weight, the weightless ones. That just didn't convince me in like literal English translation, and so it's called Faces in the Crowd, in after a line of in a poem by Ezra Pound that is important in the book. So nada que ver, Los Ingrávidos, Faces in the Crowd. Then I have a very early book of essays that I wrote in my early 20s called Papeles Falsos in Spanish, and then Sidewalks in English. So false papers in Spanish and sidewalks in English. It makes no sense. I think the only book that has the same title is La Historia de mis dientes, the story of my teeth. And then I have, so something happened. I was writing Lost Children Archive in English, and the working title was Lost Children Archive. Then I stopped and wrote Tell Me How It Ends in English. And my editors in Mexico wanted me to write it in Spanish, to rewrite it in Spanish. It's a long story that I won't tell right now. They convinced me with a few tequilas to retranslate the book myself. They made me feel very guilty as a kind of traitor of the Virgen de Guadalupe and my mother and everyone else, because I had written a book in the language of the empire, and why would I not write it in my own language? And so I self-translated it into Spanish. But Tell Me How It Ends, the title in Spanish, se presta para el albur. It's dime cómo acaba such and such persona. Like it would be a disaster. I don't think I can really explain. But those of you who have friends that speak Spanish, you may ask them, why would the translation of this title into Spanish be a disaster? But it would. And so I used the novel's title for the essay in Spanish. So the essay, Tell Me How It Ends, in Spanish is Los Niños Perdidos, the Lost Children. So when I finished the novel in Spanish, we were like, oops, we can't have two books, The Lost Children and the Archive of the Lost Children. Like it wasn't going to work. People were already confused about which one is the novel, which one's the essay, what are you doing? And so it took me a long time to find a title, like an entire summer to find the title Desierto Sonoro. It was something that a very dear friend of mine suggested. She's a writer, Samantha Schreblin, that took me to Desierto Sonoro. She suggested something almost identical to that took us then to Desierto Sonoro. So she's very much the author of this title. And it's a title that I love. I actually like it better than in English. Desierto Sonoro doesn't mean sound deserts. It means a lot of things, and that's why I like it. It means sonorous desert, a desert that sounds a lot, sonorous desert. But it can also mean the absence of sound in a desert. Un desierto sonoro, o sea, ese lugar doesn't sound. This is un desierto sonoro. But it means opposite things simultaneously. A desert that's sonorous, sounds, and a space that has no sound. And I really, really love that ambivalence, and just the sound of desierto sonoro is very beautiful. But sonorous desert in English just didn't work. It just sounds too weird, not in a good way, no? So Lost Children Archive.
Yeah, I think I love the the title in Spanish a lot more, probably. I love it carries, it's like when you say a word in English and you're like, no, it's better if we say what it is in Spanish, because it has more weight or a story to tell, even in the sounding of the name. Well, we're almost at time, and there's one more question in the chat that I'm gonna invite Florencia to read for us or present to you before we close it, because this is our first question in Spanish, and I think it's important to read.
Federico is asking, in Lost Children Archive, you invite us to tell stories as a way to understand the unthinkable. Considering D.D. Huberman's idea, which says that to know, we need to imagine ourselves, what experiences of transformation in this encounter that you have with storytelling you could share, Valeria? Want me to read it in Spanish?
Beautiful question. En Los Niños Perdidos convocas a contar historias como una manera de entender lo impensable, tomando la idea de Didi Huberman, que plantea que para saber hay que imaginarse, qué experiencias de transformación en el encuentro con la narración de historias en sentido amplio podrías compartirnos. Es una gran pregunta y muy compleja, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer it in 1 minute, and I do have a hard stop at 7:30, but just very quickly, I mean, I would say to you, with complete honesty and a little bit of embarrassment, therefore, that I think until I wrote this novel, I was not really aware of the kind of patterned violence that has played out in the USA for such a long time. And I had not seen with clarity that the violence of reservations is equal and similar, like in a kind of pattern with the violence of Japanese internment camps, with the violence of mass incarceration of Black communities and Hispanic communities, the kind of locking in or keeping out of everyone who does not really conform to the national imaginary. And for the first time, to juxtapose the Native American history that for the first time really I read seriously, before that I really hadn't, and juxtapose that to the moment of violence that we were seeing then with the putting children in cages and locking up mothers who were simply asking for asylum. It was until I wrote this book that I was able to see those things juxtaposed and understand a much deeper layer of patterned state violence.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Valeria, for joining us, and Fanny and Florencia for putting this conversation together. Thank you to the students who facilitated breakout rooms, and to Allison and Aldo, our interpreters, and to Rebecca for helping to run the Zoom. I know there's so much more that we could talk about, and I think we can build on this conversation also, in particular about the role of fiction and storytelling and the ways that we can use fiction to open up complicated narratives, just like we like to do in oral history. These are our next 2 book club events, and then we also have some training workshops coming up that you can register for through our same Eventbrite. So with that, we'll say goodbye to Valeria. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Gracias, Valeria. Thank you, everyone.
Gracias, muchas gracias. Buenas noches.
And thank you, everyone else, for your contributions.